Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class. As I kind of promised, or at least hinted at, I would try to get my wife to come lecture. And so I got my wife to come lecture. And this is my wife, Dedra Birzer. Some of you may know her. She's actually Dr. Dedra Birzer. And we used to team teach this course, which was a blast, actually. We used to have a great time doing it. The last time I taught it with her was back in 2014. So it's been a while since we've team taught, but Dedra is an expert on Latin American history, has her PhD in Latin American history, and really knows this stuff so much better than I do in all kinds of ways. So currently, if you haven't seen her around that much, it's because she's actually now the head of the South Dakota Historical Society Press. She's the executive director and editor-in-chief, right? So it's been kind of a transition in our marriage too, because we've never actually been apart from each other. But Dedra's been going out to South Dakota about 1 week out of the month. But very proud of her for that job. So she's doing great. So anyway, this is my wife, Dedra, and I will turn this over to her.
Okay, so I have to give you the caveat, which is I haven't taught Latin American history in 2.5 years. So I've been immersed. I'm proofreading a book called After Populism about the agrarian left in the northern Great Plains. That's where my brain is. Right? Proofreading, so I'm going to find all my notes. So I understand you all had a lot of questions, so I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. Most of these slides are the ones you just saw on Tuesday, but I added a few in the last time I did this, or at some point. I don't know. It all gets mixed together, more or less. And actually, Latin American history was my minor field in graduate school. So I really looked at borderlands, Spanish colonial borderlands. So what's now part of the United States that was once part of New Spain, which was once part of Meso-America. It's the Valley of Mexico that we're looking at here. And so there are a lot of similarities in the different groups that we call pre-Columbian Indian Mexico. And this is mostly from archaeology. And if you have any interest in archaeology, what's been found in Mexico is actually fairly recent in the last 100 years, a little over 100 years. It's just fascinating stuff. And so just trying to figure out what happened to all of these civilizations and where did they go. So Meso-America, so Middle America, mostly farmers, very diverse cultures, but we have some shared features. So things like a really complicated calendar based on 260 days, very sacred cycle, hieroglyphic writing on bark paper or deerskin books, maps, astronomy, use very extensive. Some kind of team game resembling basketball, that's for Nolan. Played on a special court with a solid rubber ball. So there's evidence of these courts. I have a picture of one. Large, well-organized markets. We know there's extensive trade routes that went as far as modern-day St. Louis, if not farther. So think about that. No horses, trade routes going that far. Chocolate beans used as money. Lots of wars, often just for the purpose of procuring victims for sacrifice. And very complex pantheons of gods. And the diet based on maize, also known as corn, beans, squash, and chili peppers. And these are still very much the basics of the diet in Meso-America. And so the maize or the corn is prepared by boiling it with lime and then grinding it with a hand stone. So it's called a mano on a kind of a trough called a metate. So those are now kind of in specialty gourmet shops, and you can use that to make your own salsa. You can grind up things. But that's very, very old. And then taking the dough from that and making that as tortillas, so flat cakes, or steaming and boiling them as tamales, which are in the corn husk. There's always funny stories about people who don't know what they're doing, try to eat the outer corn husk with their tamales, like people like politicians, for the most part. But these are ancient foods that have continued. Also shared with North American natives, ceremonial tobacco smoking. All right, so the map of Mexico looks kind of like a cornucopia, and Mexico is very high in elevation. Almost all of it is over 3,000 feet, and they're varied ecological zones, which meant that people had to do a lot of trading because no one area was really self-sufficient. And so that led to a lot of markets. Okay, and one thing that's really remarkable about this part, well, in the entire Americas, but we're looking at this part for now because it's going to make a big difference. There are no domesticated animals except for dogs and turkeys when the Europeans arrive. There are deer, plenty of deer, they're not domesticated, so there are no draft animals. So how are they going to carry things around? And this is really significant when we look at a lot of the archaeological finds that are left in these big temples and those Olmec heads that we'll get to. They came from 50 miles away. How did people carry those? How did they drag them? We can also, with archaeology, look at language groups and try to figure out where people came from and where they're related. So a lot of this Meso-American area is Uto-Aztecan in language groups, and that connects them to all of the native groups in North America to the northwest. So that's kind of interesting, right? So to figure out where those migration patterns occurred. Okay. So when we look at the Olmecs, we're talking about going the wrong direction. No. Where are my Olmec heads? There we go. Okay. I used to have one where there was a guy standing, and he's like this tall. Can you imagine being an archaeologist and finding these things and wondering what it is? So the Olmecs are the main group we look at in the pre-classic period. So that's about 1800 BC to 150 AD. And we don't know a lot about them, but there's a lot of art objects that have been found that tell us things. So if you look at this Olmec head, it looks like he's wearing some kind of a helmet. They came from the jungle area, so along the Gulf Coast region of Mexico, kind of southern Veracruz and Tabasco, so not very close to the Mayans, but it's an area that has a lot of rainfall and high tropical forest cover. And really what we know a lot about the Olmecs is their style. Like, this is the style. There's a lot of jaguars in this kind of mythology about were-jaguars, like werewolves, but they're jaguars. And this mythology that there's a woman who mated with a jaguar, and so the were-jaguars were the result. And there's all these small, fat babies that are little objects of jade that are in all the museums now. And so they're related to these were-jaguars. So what all that means, right, is just that's the work of archaeologists and anthropologists to try to figure it out. All we can do is guess. So we call these colossal heads. And there are three major sites that they were found during the 1930s and 40s. They're made from basalt. So that was, I was mentioning 50 miles is the nearest from where they were found. The locations are called Tres Zapotes, La Venta, and San Lorenzo. And where they were found was at least 50 miles from a source of basalt. These heads are up to 9 feet 4 inches high, and they weigh many tons. They're probably, I think, portraits of rulers. They have flat-faced, thick-lipped features. They have these headgear that are kind of like football helmets. Maybe that was protection in battle. Maybe just protection as ceremonial ball games. We don't know. Most of Olmecs were maize farmers, and probably there's a hereditary class and some kinds of things they try to figure out. So these heads suggest that there is not an equal society, right? That these are the elites. Who knows? We also know that there was something very cataclysmic that happened. Do you have your hand up?
Yes.
Yes.
So if they live in a jungle, how can they farm corn?
They cleared out. which is what they still do. And this is a big problem in the rainforest, especially in Brazil, that the people who live there need to have crops to live on, but they kind of slash and burn the rainforest so they can make way for fields. It was the same way, how did North American Indians who lived in the eastern woodlands, or in Michigan for that matter, have fields? Cleared it out. Same thing as farmers. As farmers, they are farmers. As Euro-American colonial settlers who were farmers. So this is one of the ball rings that has been excavated in an Olmec area. So I don't remember what I have next. Okay, more Olmec art. These are stelae, which means they're tall. I'm sorry, Bill doesn't get to see all of these, but they're very similar to the Toltecs. I'll get to them in a second. Okay, so this is at San Lorenzo. What I want to leave you with about the heads. So I mentioned they were found in the 1930s and the 1940s, but it's the way in which they were found, like how they were laying out, that gives a lot of clues to what happened. Because that's always our question when we get to the end of these civilizations. Well, what caused it to die? And of course, in the back of that, I think we're all thinking, our civilization's never going to die, right? Well, civilizations rise and they fall. So what caused it? And whatever happened was extremely violent. So they were deliberately destroyed. San Lorenzo and La Venta deliberately destroyed about 1200 BC, either by invasion or revolution, maybe a combination. These are grandiose monuments glorifying the rulers, and they're also glorifying the gods of their pantheon, ruthlessly smashed and defaced, then ritually buried in long lines within the highland ridges. And then those lines kind of eroded out, and the monuments tumbled down, so they were on ridges, and then the erosion caused them to tumble down into ravines. And that's where archaeologists found them. The fury of the destructive force visited upon these stones astounded archaeologists, who said that such destruction matched the labor and ingenuity that went into the creation of the sculptures. Right? So, as much effort expended on destroying them as on creating them. So that opens up a whole host of questions about what happened to the Olmec civilization. Just furious destruction. Probably La Venta, its fall was the most violent. 2440 sculptured monuments were intentionally mutilated, probably 400 to 300 BC. And so archaeologists have concluded that these civilizations didn't just kind of wither out, just kind of disappear slowly with a whimper, but they went out with a bang. Why? Don't know. Right? Hard to say, but now, or more recently, when archaeologists have found them, they find these big mounds. All right, and there are lots of sites, more than those three, all across, even into El Salvador, about 500 miles from what was the heartland of the Olmec civilization. So they had satellites, colonies that went pretty far out. Were they missions? Were they trade stations? Who knows?
Was the land contiguous, or was it kind of scattered like the Aztec had later, where they had an island here and an island here within the land, but not?
They don't know.
Okay.
I mean, because there are these spots where there are ruins, right? And because the Olmec had such a style, then they could date, they can carve and date these archaeological finds and figure out how old they are. So, don't know. Lots of questions about the Olmecs. Okay. Then we move into the classic period and the civilization known as the Toltecs, which actually were preceded. These are really out of order by the Teotihuacan. Let me go back a little bit. What do we do with Teotihuacan?
Oh, I think it's back quite a bit.
Okay, if you've ever been, there we go. Nope, I just skipped it. That's what happened. Okay, if you've ever been to the temple or the pyramid of the sun, and the pyramid of the moon in Mexico City, it's not in Mexico City, but it's about an hour away. And that was Teotihuacan. And there are two different Teotihuacan civilizations. So we're hitting on the major things. So the civilizations that seem to bring all of Meso-America together. So that's the Olmecs and the Teotihuacanis, and then the Toltecs and the Aztecs. I have to shot some water here. That's the thing about proofreading. I don't read so much. I mean, I don't talk so much. Read more, talk less. Correct a lot. Okay. So what I want to say about Teotihuacan. These were platforms, probably for various temples. And so there's a big alley, probably not the right word, like a mall, kind of like Washington, D.C., but the big mall between the monuments. So we have the Temple of the Sun and the Temple of the Moon at either side. All right, so classic Teotihuacan, and a lot of the pantheon of gods that we associate with the Aztecs, they took from Teotihuacan, and then the Toltecs built on them. And so there's not a whole lot known about Teotihuacan, apart from what's left. Why did it end? Probably some kind of agricultural disaster. We don't know. Okay. I'll figure out this thing. Wrong way. This is when I do these better when I'm on the computer itself. Okay. So Toltecs, notice the date. This is getting a little later, 900 to 1200 AD. They're seen as the highest point in terms of culture. And so the Aztecs really borrowed from them, both in terms of cosmology, like the different gods, and also their actual artifacts. So the Aztecs, when they built up their island city of Tenochtitlan, which is where Mexico City is today, and it was an island, and all the other civilizations basically made the Aztecs go there. They came in from the northwest. So from the vantage point of Mexico, the northwest is probably maybe Utah, Arizona, maybe a little bit more south of that. Moved in, we're kind of like a band of uncivilized barbarians for the most part. And so the other powers, Toltecs were kind of at the end of their days, said, okay, you can have that uninhabited island in the middle of this lake, Lake Texcoco. And they're fine, okay. And so they actually built it into this amazing civilization, but they really borrowed heavily from everybody who came before. And they weren't the only group to do that. Toltecs were the people that everybody wanted to be descended from. It's kind of like everybody saying that they had ancestors on the Mayflower, right? So it gives some kind of justification or connection that they wanted to have that is truly not there in terms of ancestry, but in terms of borrowing from culture, it's definitely there. So the Toltecs, I'm going to borrow from my archaeology book for a moment here. Of the Toltecs, it was said that nothing was too difficult for them, no place which they dealt was too distant. So their capital city, known as Tula, was a name that was used by a lot of different places because it meant the place of reeds. And so it became hard for archaeologists to kind of figure out, well, which was the real Tula? And so there's still a little bit of debate about that, but I think they finally figured it out. And they did have trouble because the Aztecs took so much of the what was left of the art, the monuments, all of that. So the Toltecs are the group associated with a language group called Nahua, of which Nahuatl is one of the many parts of it, I guess. So Nahuatl is still spoken throughout Mexico, and there are a lot of words in our understanding of English, Americanized English these days that come from Nahuatl, like coyote. That's a Nahuatl word. Anything with a TL ending, that's Nahuatl. And the Aztecs sort of took on that language. And so when the Spanish missionaries came, they learned Nahuatl to try to, so they could help explain Christianity in the language of most of the Indians. It was kind of a lingua franca, right? That's the language everybody knew, Nahuatl. So what happened to the Toltecs? Again, kind of mysterious. Nobody really knows. But this is kind of what's left of their capital. Right, and this is central Mexico with all the mountains around. And I think you probably went over this.
I didn't actually.
Okay.
No.
So even 19th century Americans who are writing these sort of epic poems, North Americans, I should say, epic history about the entire land mass, knew about the Toltecs and saw them kind of as the ancient Romans. Right, so this is from Jennings, the founders of America. And do you remember who sent this quote?
This was taken from one of the southwestern or southeastern tribes. I can't remember the Natchez out of Louisiana.
Natchez. Okay. Yeah. So before we came into this land, we lived yonder under the sun, pointing with his finger nearly southwest, by which I understood he meant Mexico. We lived in a fine country where the earth is always pleasant. There our sons had their adobe, and our nation maintained itself for a long time against the ancients of the country, who conquered some of our villages in the plains, but never could force us from the mountains. Our nation extended itself along the great water, where this large river loses itself. Sounds like the Mississippi going into the Gulf of Mexico. But as our enemies were become very numerous and very wicked, our sons sent some of their subjects who lived near this river to examine whether we could retire into the country through which it flowed. The country on the east side of the river being found extremely pleasant. I guess that would be Mississippi, Alabama. The great sun, upon the return of those who had examined it, ordered all his subjects who lived in the plains and who still defended themselves against the ancients of the country to remove into this land, here to build a temple and to preserve the eternal fire. So, we have connections, cultural connections, and people whose memories that go back centuries tie them all together, which is pretty fascinating. So one of the pantheon of gods that the Toltecs revered, and the Teotihuacanis before them, there's one of the palaces between the Temple of the Sun and the Temple of the Moon is to Quetzalcoatl, right? And there's that TL ending, so that tells you it's a Nahuatl name. And Quetzalcoatl was a god who had pale skin and a black beard, though it doesn't look like that here, but that's how he was described. And so he was expected to return. It disappeared in some fashion. I think you guys talked about that on Tuesday, and he was expected to return. So when Hernan Cortez comes to Meso-America, to what's Mexico now, in 1519, he bears quite a close resemblance to Quetzalcoatl. And so some of the peoples thought, well, maybe this was it. And when Cortez heard that, he made the most of it. Right? Wouldn't you? He took advantage of that. And so there was a lot of confusion about this. But Quetzalcoatl was revered as a very peaceful god, and in a pantheon of a lot of gods that were very, we'll say, bloodthirsty. Okay, just real quick a little bit about the Maya, and this is a terrible map that didn't expand very well. So the green area is more of a Mayan area, and if you've been to any of the temples on the, Chichen Itza, any of those, and you have a little bit of a taste of the Maya. And I'm going to come back to the Aztecs, but one of the reasons I wanted to just show this really quickly is, this is a great example, Tikal, like Chichen Itza, of some of these temples. But archaeology is really fun and not something I've really studied, but this is new technology. So, this laser imaging that can be done from space using heat. This is what it looks like in imaging. They have found all kinds of Mayan temples and villages that no one knew existed. The jungle cover is so thick around it and above it that unless you just kind of bumped right into it, you wouldn't know it was there. You can't see it from airplanes because the jungle cover is so thick. So heat imaging, laser imaging, is showing us a far larger and more connected through roads Mayan empire than archaeologists knew before. And this is a temple. No one was there. That's kind of how the imaging works, how it shows up, and the digital readouts that come from it. So this is all really new from 2018. National Geographic has done a lot with all of this. Okay, then you can see from a scaled map if you're looking down. And so they tried to, on the right here, draw out what you're seeing in those big kind of blob-looking things, right? To show where all the structures are, if you could look at them, like with a microscope or some kind of magnification and see them up close. So we're really on the edge of a lot of super interesting stuff. There are a lot of ancient Indian cultures as well, and since that doesn't really figure so much into the American West, except I just have to show the llama, because the llama is now a creature of the American West. And, the llama for South America was their only pack animal, but at least they had that. So if you can think about what seeing a horse for the very first time and not knowing such a creature existed, and then these are they human? Who knows? Covered in silver kind of metal. You don't really know metal all that much either. Right? Coming at you, and they had cannons and all kinds of things. That's going to be kind of a scary encounter. So I'm using that word, so we have encounter and conquest. So encounter is really the preferred way to think about what happens when Columbus arrives, because then it's a two-way street, right? And it is not all a conquest kind of story. There's definitely a lot of encounter going on, and there are great accounts from the Portuguese who encountered Brazil and the natives that they met there, and how they just kind of got to know each other and figured out some way to communicate. Things could be peaceful, and some of them were. However, by the time Cortez comes in 1519 to Mexico, a lot of patterns have already been set. And some of them were set with the Spanish conquest of Spain away from the Moors, the Muslims. And so they used a lot of the same patterns when they got to the New World. But when the Aztecs came to power in 1300, from their little island in Teotihuacan, and they had created this whole civilization. When the Spaniards first saw it, they were amazed. They had never seen cities like this. It was far larger and far more elaborate than any city they'd ever seen in Europe. These are the temples, and the Aztecs made a lot of enemies with their neighbors because they had these things called flower wars, where they were creating conflicts so that they could have victims to sacrifice. And then this is the Templo Mayor, the major temple. And so their victims, the hearts would be cut out of them with obsidian knives, and then the bodies would be cast down, all those steps. And now there are people who try to claim that that never happened. There's so many artifacts that show exactly what happened in the Archaeology Museum in Mexico. I don't know how people could possibly deny that, but anyway, there it is. So when Cortez arrives, there are all kinds of people who hate the Aztecs, and they're more than happy to become allies of the Spanish to take out the Aztecs. But the Aztecs had tried to bring together all this different cultural heritage from different groups, especially from the Toltecs, as I was mentioning. And who knows how long they would have stayed in power if the Spanish had not come in and done something else with them. Okay. So real quickly, we're going to be jumping around a little bit from what Brad is going to do with you guys, but I want to talk about Indian population decline. So what happens to all of the many people who are living in the Caribbean islands and in Meso-America when the Spanish get there?
Who was the Aztec king that they captured when they conquered?
Montezuma?
Yeah.
Montezuma. Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting stories about that. Okay, so when Cortez arrived in 1519, there were probably 15 million people living in what's now Mexico. 100 years later, there were 1.5 million. And similar demographic collapse in the Andes in South America. So a century after first contact between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the regions least affected by that lost at least 80% of their people. Most places lost 90% of their people, and some regions became totally destitute of their original inhabitants. I should say, they're not the original inhabitants, but the people who were there when the Spanish arrived. Okay, so this number is very controversial and political, like how many people died, because it depends on who's arguing about it, and because some groups really want to cast a lot of negativity, is a really polite way to put it, on the Spanish, right? That the Spanish were evil. This is called the Black Legend. The Spanish wanted to wipe out all these people. One of my graduate school professors always harped on this and said, no. The Spanish didn't want to do any work. They didn't want to get their hands dirty. So they would never kill off all their workers intentionally. Right? And of course, people did not understand things about germ theory, and the populations from Europe had withstood all kinds of plagues. Right? The people who still were around in 1519 right, had unbelievable antibodies. They might have been able to withstand COVID. Who knows? Right? The peoples of the Americas didn't have that. They didn't have that experience in their genetic makeup. And so they were susceptible to everything that was brought with them. And even a lot of Europeans succumbed. The second Columbian journey to the Caribbean brought with it swine flu that's carried by pigs. They didn't know, but they brought all these pigs with them that were sick and wiped out as many Spanish as Taino people on those islands. What's called Hispaniola is now half of it's Haiti and half of it's Dominican Republic. And this disease factor was just enormous. So this question always comes up about the conquistadors from Spain and from Portugal and their intent. And of course, it is a demographic disaster. So if you think about even with, we kind of understand this a little better maybe now than the last time I taught it, having kind of, well, maybe still kind of in a pandemic of sorts. You know, if everybody's sick, even if they survive, nobody is farming, right? Nobody is making sure that there's going to be something to eat, right? We can still see problems with the supply lines in our advanced civilizations, right? If you want to buy a car, it's becoming very difficult. There are hardly any new cars out there because the chips aren't being manufactured that govern all the electronics in it. So this whole demographic collapse was just as much about famine and starvation as it was about disease. All right. So I think that's a good place. Do you have anything else about the Aztecs? Yes. So this is Mexico City. So while I was talking about archaeology, I'll talk about this just a little bit. When they started making subways in the late 1960s in Mexico, because they were hosting the Olympics, the 1968 Olympics, they started finding, when they were digging, all of these ruins. And so the Spanish had taken down the Templo Mayor that we had the drawing of, brick by brick, used those bricks to build the cathedral, but also then just covered everything else. So they drained the lakes and just buried all this other stuff. And so now, or when they were starting the subways, they found all these things, but over the centuries, the people knew where certain statues of their gods had been buried. And so there were always piles of marigolds, which was kind of a sacred flower for the Aztecs called cempasúchil. And so the Spanish were like, what is going on? There are always these flowers here, and they dug up and they found one of the really bloody gods, a female god, Quetzalcoatl, was buried there. So when you go to Mexico City and just in the subway stations, they're like archaeology museums because they have everything on display. This is pretty interesting to see. This is one of the things that really freaked out Cortez and his people, to see this wall that had been made out of skulls from all of the, not all of them, but a small number of them actually, of the victims of Aztec sacrifice. And that was a big motivator for the Spanish who were there to take out the Aztecs. Like, this cannot stand. This goes against everything that we believe in. So we're going to make sure it stops. And then I'm going to stop here because that's another section. Okay, questions, and then we'll let you get to Columbus because I think that's next, right? Yes.
So, like, how many Aztecs were in their capital city when, like, Hernan Cortez, like, took over? What do you have, like 500 men or something when he took over the city with, like, the help of the other Indians?
Fewer than that. So there's a very complicated story about them. They were brought in kind of as allies, but they were kind of being held prisoner and kind of forced their way out and then came back later. But in between, another arrival of Cortez had shown up, named Panfilo de Narvaez, who was basically a pirate, had a war catch, everything. And he had been always a rival in trying to get the riches, right? This is the motivation of these Spanish, right? That they wanted gold. And so all the different peoples they came across, because they landed in Veracruz and they were marching across to Mexico City. And so all the people they met, they'd say, hey, do you have gold? And they're like, we don't. But those people over there do. So they would continue, right, moving. And of course, also some of the people wanted the help of these Spaniards in trying to overthrow the Aztecs. And so Montezuma said, you know what, I've got a room full of gold. I'll give it to you if you'll just leave. Right? Take it and go away. Forget we ever existed. And they kind of said, oh, sure. And when they had to flee, it's called the Noche Triste, the sad night, the Spaniards, some of them had so much gold in their pockets that they had to get across all of these causeways because they were on the island and had to get to the mainland. And the Aztecs, part of their defenses were in the causeways, they could lift up the bridges. And so the Spanish had to get across, and the gold weighed some of them down so heavily they drowned. And the later ones just crossed all of the dead bodies. And they also had to figure out how to counteract the forces. The Aztecs did, which they did a good job of figuring out ways to do that. So that's part of some of the soldiers or the conquistadors who survived really looked back at that whole episode as having God's hand of providence on it, because they couldn't figure out otherwise how they survived and how they won. Right? So when they come back, they figured out that they have to have ships. Right? They have to have a way to get across the lake, and they figured out how to carry parts of a ship and put it together right there on the shore and then sail. And they really had a lot of ingenuity going with that, and they had been reinforced by Panfilo de Narvaez, but he had someone with smallpox on his board that he didn't know about. Right? So that's what starts the smallpox epidemic among the Indians, and that helps the Spanish to prevail because they're all so wiped out. So with the swine flu, that hadn't reached. That was 1493 when that epidemic hit. We're talking about 1521 now. So, yeah. And those exact numbers are not in my head, but it's really a small group.
Anybody else have questions?
Tone girls.
We always talk about the diseases that the Spanish and the Europeans brought, but did the Indians have any diseases that got transmitted?
Syphilis, they'd had for a long time. And if you know European history, you know what happened with that.
Yeah. You said that some scholars doubt whether the Aztecs actually sacrificed so many victims on their temples.
I don't know if I say scholars, but
Okay. Like, what evidence are they pointing to for that?
they don't like it.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
before we came to Hillsdale, we were brought here by a guy named John Wilson, who's retired now. But I taught for a year at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And I was giving basically a similar lecture to what Dedra just gave. I wasn't doing nearly as nice a job as she just did. But I had a young man in class who stood up and started singing to protest what I was saying about the Aztecs. And he wouldn't let me lecture. So I let him, he finished his song. And then I asked him what was going on. And he disrupted everything. And it was pretty interesting. He was an Aztec revivalist. And so in his mind, all of Catholicism was totally evil, and I was a spokesman for the Catholic Church by talking about Cortez in a positive light. So he and I went out afterwards and talked about it, but it was weird. It was really weird.
Yeah, they don't like that portrayal of their people, even though the evidence trail, as I was mentioning at the Anthropology Museum, Archaeology Museum, is just huge.
Well, yeah, that is kind of interesting though. That like, are there then also like other natives though that like say to the people that like deny the Aztec sacrifices, like, no, it did happen, and like my tribe were one of those thousands of tributes that were sent over there, because like they, as you were saying, like the Spanish found some pretty willing allies, but
Right. And they kept pretty good records, the Spanish did, or they would have back. One of the major accounts that we have is from Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who's writing like 30 years later, but he's very detailed in his account of all of the people that they encountered like that. But of course, it's the conquerors who are writing the history. And so the Aztecs were the conquerors, right? And then they became the conquered. Right? It happens a lot. So.
How do you suppose that this Aztec revivalism got started? Because
I think it's part about the larger civil rights movement. And in Mexico, there was, it started like the late 19th century, kind of a cultural emphasis on their indigenous past and trying to break away from Europe and trying to find what is our identity as kind of this new people. And actually, that's a great question that I usually talk about. So one of the huge things that happens is this language barrier, right? So they have to figure out how to talk to each other. And I can't believe I forgot this, is one of my favorite stories. So when Cortez is sort of making his way from Veracruz, and he did burn the ships, so they couldn't go back, right? So he made sure that this is what they were going, and they're going to do, right? They were going to march inland. He kept hearing from people that there was someone like him, like through whatever means they were using to communicate with one another. There was someone like him that had skin like his color, and so they managed to find this person. And there had been a shipwreck earlier on one of the islands off of the Mayan Peninsula and off the Yucatan, and there were two Spaniards on that, and Geronimo de Aguilar was his name. So he knew Spanish, and he learned Mayan. And then Cortez, so they had Geronimo de Aguilar, so he could translate from Mayan, right? But they weren't in the Mayan area. And then Cortez was given all these gifts, including gifts of women, when they went from village to village. And one of the women given to them had been enslaved, captured, and enslaved, and she was from the Mayan area, and she knew Nahuatl. So they were able to have a very complicated chain of communication, right? So Cortez and his men could talk to the shipwrecked Geronimo de Aguilar, who knew Mayan, and then he could talk to, her name was, her Spanish name, they baptized her name was Doña Marina, but she was Malincine to Nepal, and then she became known as La Malinche. She's the mother of the Mestizo people, right? Because she and Cortez had at least one child, who was Martin Cortez. And so La Malinche was kind of like an insult, kind of, so he was called El Malinche, about her, like he was identified by her. But nonetheless, anyway, that's the cultural interpretation part is super important. So because she knew Nahuatl since she had been captured, and she was actually from a royal line, and so she was pretty well respected, and the Spanish loved her, who were with Cortez, and she really had a place in their hearts. And so she's a controversial figure today too, because she aided Cortez so much, which is really crazy because she was sold into, or put into slavery, not sold by her own people, but she was captured, and she really didn't have a whole lot of choice in what she was going to do here. But she is the mother of the Mestizo people. So on October 12th, that we call Columbus Day, which has been quite controversial since 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's landing in 1492 in Mexico. That's the Dia de la Raza, the day of the race, the day of the mixing of the races. In South Dakota, it's Indigenous Peoples Day. I think that's a good segue into Columbus for you.
Well, let me ask Dee. So you started off talking about food, and it's interesting. I realize there are a lot of varieties of Mexican food, but essentially Mexican food is Meso-American food. It's not Spanish.
Right.
And I think that's something, it gives us a sense of how deeply rooted this culture is. Obviously, you would add beef and pork.
Right.
That wouldn't have been native.
Which is why they brought all the pigs
spices are native,
and got the
and
swine.
preparations native.
Yeah. And the pigs really took off. And anybody who lives around Austin, Texas can tell you, it took off way too much. Yes, right, feral pigs, huge problem.
I have one other question. And I mentioned this to him on Tuesday, but can you just talk a little bit about, because it's become such a symbol of Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe?
Sure, I didn't do my notes about that. But so not long after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, enormous numbers of conversions happen because the indigenous peoples kind of look at this and say, all right, our God's lost and your God's won. And also there's C.S. Lewis, I always fall back on this, has argued that every culture has a piece of the gospel, the Christian gospel in it, so that when they're presented with it, they can recognize it. And so it's not any different at all throughout what we call Latin America now. So as the story goes, there's it's probably in his 50s, that Christian Indian who spoke Nahuatl in central Mexico, around what became Mexico City, named Juan Diego, and he was hurrying along, trying to care for a sick uncle, and the Virgin Mary appeared to him in the form of an Aztec princess, which he would have recognized. And so she said to him, take this message to the bishop and tell him he needs to build a chapel in my honor right here. And he says, no one's going to believe me. How am I going to tell them this? And there are a couple of back and forth things about this. I'm kind of putting it to one story here in the interest of time. And so she says, I will give you a sign. And so when he goes back by that spot the next day to go to Mexico City to appear to the bishop, in front of the bishop, there are all these flowers, and they're out of season. It's December. They're completely out of season, and so he gathers up all the flowers, following directions of Our Lady, and scoops them up into his tilma. So a tilma is a very coarse cloth from woven maguey fibers, like agave maguey fibers that were easily found. It's not going to survive very long, right? It doesn't have longevity at all, so this is something that peasants would wear, poor people would wear. And so he gathers up all the flowers, and he's got them scooped up in his tilma. And then when he gets to, it takes a while to convince the people at, it's the offices of the bishop, which sounds far more glorious than it probably would, to let him in, to let him have an audience with the bishop. But he finally does, and then he wants to give the bishop the flowers as a sign, and he opens up his tilma and drops the flowers, and the impression of Our Lady of Guadalupe was on his tilma. So that's the exact image that we see everywhere. Is on there. It's still on there. It's in the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe outside of Mexico City. Survived all these years, and lots of things that we've been able to do with technology now, and so you can see, not with the naked eye, but with a microscope, that in Our Lady's eyes on the tilma is the reflection of all the people who were there. So you can see them in the eyes, and they look exactly like the way our eyes see, kind of upside, what would we think of as upside down, how those images then are reflected in our brain, be right side up. So all of that is exactly scientifically the way it should be. And this, why has this survived all of these years? So all kinds of miracles around that. And Our Lady of Guadalupe then is enormously important as a cultural symbol for people who do not believe in Christianity throughout Mexico and the rest of Latin America and North America too. She's a protectress of North America. That Mary is taking this whole land, this new land, and bringing it with her, right? Bringing it to God. And so they felt like that connection, that God was specifically speaking to these people, the lowliest of the Indians, and sort of bringing them in. And so for religious history in Mexico, it's extremely important. So it's 1520s. About 1526.
Not long after the conquest.
No.
I mean, so that, I think that's really important. And again, whether you believe in the faith aspect of it or not, it's such an important cultural symbol.
Yeah, so all the bus drivers and these little buses in Mexico City, they all have big Our Lady of Guadalupe symbols and stuff. And then they'll have like Playboy symbols on their mud flaps. This is a problem. Okay. I've taken up far more time than I was supposed to, like twice as long.
That was great. Thanks.
Okay.
Any
Christopher Columbus.
questions? You've got one other question.
yes,
Quick question. I don't have the date written down correctly. Smallpox, you said was
1519. 1518. So it started earlier, but in Mexico then, because they're not in Mexico till 1519. So it's more like 1520, 1521. In Mexico, because one of the reasons that Cortez has to leave Mexico City, why things go south very quickly in Mexico City, is because he's got to go deal with I just lost his name, Narvaez, Panfilo de Narvaez, the pirate. Cortez has to go deal with him, and so the people he leaves in charge don't do things very well. And then Montezuma ends up being killed by his own people. They throw a rock at it and hits him in the head, and that's it. So, and if he had survived, maybe things would have done better. But then that smallpox, so 1518 in the Caribbean islands. So that's why someone who's on the ship coming from the Caribbean has smallpox, they don't know it. And then they bring it to all of Mexico eventually in 1520.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Now, how am I going to return to 20th century agrarian populism?
Do you need keys?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. I'll leave you guys.
Yeah, I'll see you at home.
Because I have to work.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you. Here's my bag. Chair. There we go. I would not have these keys if I didn't.
Okay, so Just a couple of things to follow up on what Dedra was saying. One of the reasons, and I'm really glad she was able to come do that, but one of the reasons that I wanted to focus on this, especially when we're getting into Spanish conquest here in a little bit, is just to understand how vital it is that there were these thriving Indian civilizations here. So when we're talking about these Indian civilizations like the Olmecs or the Toltecs, and clearly I didn't know that the Teotihuacan, I didn't realize they were separate from the Toltecs, so I'm glad Dedra straightened me out on that. And all of us, right, since I told you that on Tuesday, that was just another name for the Toltecs and their capital city. But I think when we look at these in the Mayans, we need to recognize that there were these really, really complex civilizations in North and South America. And in North America, we have two major civilizations as well that are all related to these Mexican civilizations. One is what I have here right on the screen, and this is the Anasazi that we see really thriving from about 300 AD up until 1300, so for about 1,000 years. This is all in the Four Corners region of the United States. Really incredible architecture. They had the largest apartment buildings the world had ever seen until New York created new ones in, I think, the 1860s, 1870s. You had just huge apartment complexes and all these cliff dwellings and so forth among these people living at the Anasazi. There you can see some of them, some of the cliff palace ruins and the way that these people lived. And you have these very complex social structures here as well. Probably a lot of archaeologists think that this is probably related to the Toltecs. That is, that the Olmecs and the Toltecs had such an influence on the early part, or the middle part of Mexico, that their influence spread into North America as well, particularly to the Anasazi. But there you get Chaco Canyon, one of the biggest ruins that we have in the American Southwest. But then we also have another place, and that's what's now St. Louis. Huge city there called Cahokia that existed from about 750 all the way up until 1200. Now, notice the dates there. I think it's very interesting. All of these civilizations, the Aztecs come, remember, about 1300, 1350. The Anasazi fall around 1300. The mound builders fall around 1200. We have no idea what caused these incredible declines in these cultures, but all of them failed at roughly the same time. The Aztecs continue, of course, well beyond this time period, but they don't do so as an innovative civilization. They do so as a parasitic civilization. That is, they're living almost exclusively off what they had inherited from the Olmecs and the Toltecs. So there is some kind of great decline. And imagine, if Europe had been invaded during its dark ages by some major force, how different the whole history of Europe would be if it had not been just some remnants here and there attacking various parts of Europe. Think about if we had been in a dark age during a time period of great conquest. This is what happens to the American Indian. They're in a dark age. They're in a dark age that begins roughly about 1250, 1300, that you could say extends all the way up until the final conquest of the American West, about 1890. That entire period, the Indians are in a dark age. So you've got a people, the Europeans, who are clearly on the rise, but then you have these other peoples, the Indians, who are very much in decline. So you've got to wonder, just hypothetically, what would have happened had the Europeans, say, encountered the American Indian in 1200 rather than in 1492, and especially before the Europeans had gone through their own disease phase through the Black Plague. So it's an interesting question to ask, but do keep in mind that when we're talking about the American Indian tribes, we're definitely talking about a people in a dark age. And so they don't have the same kind of civilizational tools that they had once had in terms of calendars, architecture, everything. Yeah, Alex.
Are these Anasazi and mound builder civilizations, are they as violent as the Aztecs?
We have absolutely no idea how violent the Anasazi are. What we have in the Southwest, we have all kinds of burial pits with bodies that have clearly been mutilated by other human beings. There are burial pits everywhere, and archaeologists are completely torn whether or not these were the Anasazi doing it to themselves, or whether they had been invaded and probably some group like the Aztecs or primitive Aztecs had done this in some way. Clearly there were some very barbaric peoples at the time, but we don't know where they came from. Cahokia, we do have good evidence because there are a number of oral traditions that were passed down through people like the Miami Indians, which Miamis, don't think of Florida, the Miami Indians are actually in northern Indiana and southern Michigan, but they had all kinds of oral traditions that came from the time period when they had been part of Cahokia. And those oral traditions suggest that all of the religion of Cahokia was based on this kind of giant death cult in which there were massive sacrifices being made, similar to what we saw with the Aztecs. So probably in a place like Cahokia, there is a really inhumane, extremely anti-humane religion. And among the Anasazi, we just don't know. And that really is, if you pick up any kind of scientific magazine, they'll talk about this great debate over the Anasazi, because some people like to portray them as kind of these almost libertarians, great humane people of North America. Others try to portray them as these kind of death squad Nazis. So you actually get language like that. So in the way they talk about them.
So that's the greatest debate surrounding them right now. Is there one camp that predominates, or
not with the Anasazi? It's almost evenly split. Those who think that it was an internal struggle, and those who think that they were. So one of the reasons that people think that the Anasazi may have been peaceful and it may not have been responsible for the barbaric invasions is because what I was showing you on the slides, that they built their dwellings up high in the cliffs. In other words, basically for self-protection against nomadic tribes. So that's a possibility. I have never climbed up to these cliffs, but I've heard that, especially in the higher ones, it's extremely dangerous to go from apartment to apartment, and it would have been like that, obviously, during their day and age as well. So the fact that they would put themselves at risk like that is telling that this was probably not something that they chose to do out of, well, it was something they did because they were protecting themselves more than anything else. So most likely. But again, Alex, I'm not sure. So yeah.
I'm not jumping too far ahead of the
Oh, no,
class,
please.
but the mound builders, did like early Mormons refer to this civilization at all?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so this is a great question, and you're not jumping ahead at all. You're right where we should be, and I probably should have mentioned it when I was talking about it. One of the things that so astounded people like Thomas Jefferson, who's just fascinated with all of this, is where did these mounds come from? Because it seemed very clear that the people they encountered around the mounds, that is the Native Americans of their time, that they clearly could not have been responsible for these mounds. So Mormonism is probably the most distinguished explanation for where these people came from. But Mormonism was not unique in arguing that there had been an earlier civilization here that had nothing to do with the current American Indians. There was a lot of discussion, and Mormonism, again, will make this the kind of its highest form in terms of expression. But there was a lot of discussion that one of the tribes, the Lost Tribes of Israel, had created. They were the ones who had come over and created all these great civilizations, but then had been beaten out by these Native Americans, whoever they were. So, yeah, that was a major source of controversy at the time of Jefferson, especially in the 1700s and in the 1800s. Huge, and among scientists. So and Dr. Kalthoff does such a good job with this, but one of the great debates that was going on at the same time was the debate between monogenesis and polygenesis. So was there one creation or were there multiple creations? So an Adam and Eve story or lots of Adam and Eve. And basically the cooler heads kind of prevailed towards monogenesis and one creation among scientists, but it was still part of this debate. So was it possible that there was a separate creation of Indians, a separate creation of blacks, a separate creation of whites? That was a big source of controversy at the time. And I want to mention too, someone asked me after class on Tuesday why I say American Indians. Was I trying to make a political point by doing that? No, I'm not. I mean, you can say indigenous peoples or American Indians or Amerindian was the kind of fashionable term when I was going through grad school. You can say First Peoples, First Nations. You can use any of those terms. Most American Indians say Indian.
And when they're talking about those who aren't in their tribe, when they're talking about their tribe, they describe themselves as Lakota or whatever they may be. But I didn't want anyone to think I'm not, just because this is Hillsdale, I'm not making a political point, I promise. It's just when I was a kid, they were called American Indians, so that's how I think of it. But yeah, that was not intentional. So, but I appreciated that someone asked me about that. Okay, any other questions on this? If not, I'm going to shift.
How
Susan.
how widespread were these mound builders?
Oh.
Aren't there like mounds in Wisconsin or some other places?
Yes, there are mounds all the way from the middle of the Great Plains. So basically right where the prairie becomes the Great Plains, all from North Dakota all the way down to Texas. On the side that's more of an eastern, little more humid, that side all the way to upstate New York, there are mounds. So there's a mound in Hillsdale County, right? And it's a small one. It's a very small one. And yeah, I didn't know how much we should get into this, but for example, in Temple Mound, this is called Temple Mound here in Cahokia in St. Louis, right outside of St. Louis. And when you dig into these mounds, they found hundreds of bodies. So usually one ruler with all their servants were being buried in them. And this is part of that kind of death cult and what's going on with that kind of that image around these various things, dealing with violence and so forth. And so yeah, there's a lot of, those mounds are everywhere. Pretty amazing. So yeah, Sasha.
Totally. I went there as a kid multiple times, and you're allowed to climb up on top of them. I
Oh,
don't think
yeah.
I ever just processed like what exactly.
That you're walking on top of a fallen pyramid.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it's, I don't, did you know the history of this?
I did in the past, not anymore. That used to
Yeah.
fascinate me. I went there like 4 times and learned javelin throwing while I was there.
Well, very nice. Its other name is called Monk's Mound.
Yes.
And the reason is because the Catholic Church built a monastery on top of the pyramid to try and sanctify it. It's not there anymore. I mean, it's been reclaimed. This is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's got quite a history. Michael.
Where's the mountain in Hillsdale County?
It is right on the border with Ohio. So it's as far south as you can go. And then there are a few mounds on the Ohio side as well.
Yeah, Serpent
And
Mound.
then, what's that, Alex?
Serpent Mound, and then
That's in,
or-
yeah. And then some big ones in Ohio,
Yeah.
really big, yeah. Most of them are pyramidal shape or round, but there are some like the serpent. There's a serpent mound in Kansas, and then there's one in Ohio that are actually huge snakes that you can see from the air. So pretty amazing. Patricia.
So were all the mounds pyramids or just graves?
No, not all were pyramids. Some of they were mostly burial sites, but burial for the elite, but not all. Some of them were just made as sites of worship as well. So that imitation throughout all of eastern United States. But just imagine, I mean, in Cahokia itself, we estimate that there were 30,000 people living there at, say, roughly 1200 AD. Right? That's incredible. That's much bigger than, say, London or Barcelona at the time. And we think probably one of the reasons that they fell apart is they probably overextended their own ability to conquer the environment, to feed themselves in this region. So there are a couple of different things. We also know, again, I didn't know how much to get into all of this, but there was a mini ice age, a very small ice age in the 1200s. And then in places like the American Southwest, there was a drought from 1276 until about 1299. So for about 23 years, there was a serious drought. And so you have not only a cooling, it was about 10 degrees cooler on average than it is now. Not only do you have a cooling, but you also have this drought at the same time. All of those things played a role in all of this coming down. Yeah. Who else had their hand up? Yeah. What's your name?
Drew.
Drew, thanks.
I was going to ask, when you say like a burial mound for the elite, is it the kind of Egyptian idea where they bury the entire family?
Very similar. But and we actually, archaeologists call them bureaucracies, which is kind of funny. But so you bury your bureaucracy, everyone who's in the family, and all of your royal servants would go with them as well. So kind of nice. We did that to someone. So, okay, anything else? If not, I'm going to switch really quickly just to end us today to another topic. And I want to talk just briefly about what we call the Columbian Exchange. And I want to just leave you with something here, because Columbus has become such a controversial figure for us. When I was a kid, Columbus was a hero, and then we get to 1992, which was the 500th anniversary of Columbus coming to the New World, and everything changes, in which, as Dedra said, we suddenly have things like Indigenous Peoples Day and so forth. And I want to stress that there are really complicated factors dealing with someone like Columbus. And I wanted to just give you two quotes here from his own diaries and the way that he's preparing for his voyage and how he sees this voyage. He says, during the time, that is, as he's preparing to come, he doesn't know it's the Americas, of course. He thinks he's going to Japan or to China. During this time, I searched out and studied all kinds of texts, geographies, histories, chronologies, philosophies, and other subjects. With a hand that could be felt, the Lord opened my mind to the fact that it would be possible to sail from here to the Indies, or India. Not what we think of the Indies, but India. And he opened my will to desire to accomplish this project. This was the fire that burned within me when I came to visit your highnesses, meaning to Ferdinand and to Isabella. And then, this is amazing. For the execution of the journey to the Indies, I was aided not by intelligence, by mathematics, or by maps. It was simply the fulfillment of what Isaiah prophesied. Columbus was a mystic, right or wrong, whether he really experienced these things or not. He truly believed that he was ushering in the apocalypse. One of the things that was absolutely necessary for the apocalypse was for an opening of a passage to India, that is, to the Indies, in order for the Spanish to be able to convert on the other side of Islam. So Islam was blocking, of course, Western Europe's expansion into the East. But if they could bypass it by going around the world and attacking Islam from the other side, they could convert the world to Christianity. And there was a belief that the Chinese, the emperor of the Chinese was called the Great Khan of the Golden Horde. That's how they mention it in these documents. What a title. I would love that if we had that for like our president, the Great Khan of the Golden Horde. But they really believed that the emperor of China was desirous of converting to Christianity, that there was something in Confucianism that would allow Christianity to flourish in a place like China, and therefore they could ease out the Muslims. And not just ease out, but get rid of the Muslims. And once they did that, then the whole world would be ready for the apocalypse for the New Jerusalem. So these are wild things that we don't often think about when we talk about someone like Columbus, but it really becomes important. So just keep that in mind, that even though he comes out of the Renaissance, he is much more of a Christian figure than he is a Renaissance figure in terms of the way that we think about his voyage and what he's going to do. But we'll come back to all of that next week on Tuesday. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.